There's someone in your world. You've crossed paths with them. Maybe you worked alongside them for months. Maybe it was just one conversation at a gathering. But something about them stuck with you. Not because they were the loudest, not because they dominated every conversation, not because they wore their success like a badge. They had this quality, something ineffable, unmistakable. When they entered a space, things shifted. People became more aware of themselves, more conscious of how they were showing up. Yet they did absolutely nothing to create this effect. No rehearsed lines, no calculated moves, just present. Now think about someone different, polished, prepared, every word in its proper place, every gesture timed precisely. They've studied how to do this. They've invested in getting it right. The handshake arrives exactly when it should. The eye contact never wavers. The voice maintains its perfect tone. Technically, everything is executed flawlessly, and yet, something in you knows you're watching a performance. The moment you recognize the performance, the respect evaporates. In that recognition lives a paradox that the entire confidence industry refuses to address directly. The harder you work to appear confident, the more you undermine actual confidence. What follows is not a blueprint. It's not a system for projecting authority or manufacturing an impressive presence. It's an examination of what real confidence actually is, where it originates, why certain people possess it naturally, and why chasing it through conventional methods leads nowhere. The answers aren't what you want to hear, but they're true. And if you can sit with them honestly, they transform how you understand yourself and every single person you'll ever meet. Every confidence workshop begins in the wrong place. Every article about commanding respect, every YouTube video on social dominance, they all start with the same assumption. Confidence is something you do. It's an action, a set of behaviors, a performance that, if executed consistently enough, eventually becomes real. You adopt the stance. You practice the speech patterns. You train yourself to respond a certain way. Eventually, the thinking goes, the reality catches up to the act. The entire industry is built on this assumption, and the entire industry is wrong. Confidence isn't a behavior. It's not a skill set you acquire through repetition, the way you might learn an instrument or a language. Real confidence is something different entirely. Real confidence is a state of internal settlement. It's your relationship with yourself. How much you need the external world to validate your existence. How comfortable you are being exactly who you are in any situation, regardless of how that situation unfolds. This is not a small semantic difference. This is the difference between a house built on bedrock and a house built on painted cardboard that looks like bedrock. On clear days, they appear identical. The moment pressure arrives, the difference becomes catastrophically obvious. The confusion runs so deep that most people can't feel the difference within themselves. They've been conditioned so thoroughly to think of confidence as performance that they've lost touch with what genuine internal confidence actually feels like. So they chase the behaviors instead. They force eye contact until it becomes aggression masquerading as presence. They mimic the speech patterns of people they admire, without understanding that those people speak slowly because they're genuinely unhurried, not because they decided to speak slowly. They stand in power poses in bathrooms before meetings, chasing a hormonal surge that lasts 12 minutes and solves nothing. Research tells us one thing, but more importantly, lived experience confirms it. The people who genuinely command the most respect are not thinking about commanding respect. They're not running a background process that monitors reactions and adjusts in real time. That monitoring, that constant calculation of how you're landing, that's exactly what destroys presence. Real presence is what happens when that process stops. When you're simply in the room, fully, without a piece of your attention peeled off to manage how you're being perceived. Think about the most genuinely compelling people you've encountered. Not the most technically skilled at social performance, but the ones who left you with the clear sense that you'd been near something real. Were they managing an impression? Were they performing? Or were they simply completely, undeniably themselves? The answer is almost always the same. And what made them magnetic wasn't something they added to themselves. It was just themselves. Without dilution, without apology, without the constant interior static of people who aren't sure they're enough. This is what genuine confidence is, the absence of that static. Not the absence of doubt. Confident people doubt constantly. Not the absence of fear. Confident people feel fear. Not the absence of imperfection. Confident people are imperfect in ways they can name without flinching. What's absent is the need for external permission to exist as you are. And here's what happens because of that. The moment you stop needing the room to validate you, you become paradoxically the person the room most wants to validate. The performance-based approach misses this inversion entirely. It fails not because it's unconvincing. Sometimes the performance is very convincing. It fails because it reinforces the exact wound it's trying to heal. Every time you modify yourself to manage what someone thinks about you, you send a message to the deepest part of yourself. Your natural state is insufficient. You deepen that wound. You become more dependent on the performance, not less. The people worth impressing, the genuinely perceptive ones, they can feel this dependency. They can't always articulate why, but they know something underneath is off. What needs to happen isn't a better performance. It's the systematic dismantling of the need to perform at all. This is slower than memorizing power moves, more demanding, but it's the only approach that actually works. And it starts with something almost no one addresses: why you ever became dependent on external validation in the first place. There's a mechanism running inside you right now that you almost certainly didn't choose and probably aren't fully aware of. It operates continuously, beneath conscious thought. It's responsible for a significant portion of your daily emotional experience. It monitors people around you, their expressions, their tone, the quality of their attention, the micro-signals in their body language. It interprets all of this as data about your worth. When the signals are positive, it releases a small dose of relief. When they're neutral or negative, it releases a spike of alarm. This mechanism is so embedded in normal social experience that most people never notice it operating. They just feel vaguely good when they sense approval and vaguely anxious when they don't. They think it's personality, a natural response to how social interaction works. They don't recognize it as a trap. It is exactly that. Psychologically, this is called external locus of evaluation. The research is unambiguous. People who derive their sense of self-worth primarily from external sources, from the approval and positive regard of others, are consistently more anxious, more reactive, more emotionally volatile, and less satisfied with their lives than people who've developed an internal standard for evaluating themselves. This correlation isn't marginal. It holds across cultures, age groups, social contexts. It's robust. And here's the critical part. External validation is addictive. It provides brief, unreliable relief from the underlying anxiety of not being sure you're enough. Like any addiction, each dose is followed by the need for another. The underlying condition that made you reach for it stays untreated and grows. Most people think this dependency developed because of something wrong with them, a character flaw, a personality weakness. It didn't. It developed because you were human, you were young, and you lived in an environment where the things you needed to survive, love, safety, resources, were conditional. Not necessarily through cruelty or neglect, but conditionally enough that a part of your nervous system learned something critical. How you were perceived by others mattered for your survival. Children who receive love based on performance, being good, being smart, being impressive, being what others needed you to be, learn that approval is something you earn through behavior. Your developing brain cannot treat this lesson casually. It's a survival lesson. By the time you're an adult, you've been running this program so long that it feels like personality. You think you're someone who naturally cares what others think. You think your sensitivity to social feedback is just who you are. It's not who you are. It's what happened to you, calcified into pattern. And patterns can be examined and changed. Not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. The validation trap disguises itself as social awareness. People deep in it interpret their constant monitoring of others' reactions as empathy, interpersonal sensitivity, the natural result of caring about people. There's some truth in that. Genuine care for others is real. But there's a crucial difference between caring how someone feels and needing them to respond to you in a specific way so you can feel okay. The first is generosity. The second is extraction wearing a generosity costume. People can feel the difference even if they can't name it. The costs of this trap are enormous. It costs you presence. A part of your attention is always occupied with monitoring external reactions rather than being fully in whatever you're doing. It costs you authenticity. The version of yourself you present is always being calibrated for approval rather than expressing what's actually true. It costs you resilience. Your emotional state becomes contingent on things you can't control, whether people happen to be generous, whether the room happens to be responsive, whether circumstances align with the image you're protecting. And it costs you the very thing you're chasing: respect. Because the harder you work to earn approval, the more clearly you signal your need for it. And people don't respect, at a deep, instinctive level, those who need them. But here's what people do respect. People who have learned to meet their own needs without requiring others to behave a specific way. Everyone has needs. Loneliness, the desire for recognition, the wish to be perceived well. The difference is what you do with those needs. People who command respect have found ways to meet those needs that don't require other people to cooperate. They've developed an independence from the outcomes of social transactions. And that independence makes them genuinely free, therefore genuinely attractive in the deepest sense. The path out of this trap isn't indifference. It's not becoming someone who doesn't care about others. It's developing such a solid relationship with yourself that external feedback becomes information instead of verdict. That shift from verdict to information changes everything. When someone with genuine psychological authority walks into a room, something happens. It's not social. It's not cultural. It's not a matter of preference. Something happens neurologically. In you. In everyone present. Understanding what that something is matters, not because it's interesting, but because it explains why certain people command respect effortlessly, while others, despite their best efforts, can't seem to access that quality. The human nervous system evolved in a social environment where rapid assessment of others' psychological states was a survival skill. Before language could carry nuance, before institutions and written agreements, humans depended on the ability to read each other at levels far below conscious processing. The cues they read weren't primarily visual, not posture or eye contact as a checklist. They were somatic. They read the other person's nervous system. They assessed whether that person was afraid, calm, defensively alert, or genuinely at ease. And they did it instantly. Thinking about it would have been too slow. That same neurological machinery is running in you right now, in every social interaction. When you encounter another person, your nervous system does a rapid, automatic assessment of theirs. It reads breathing rate, micro-expressions, the quality of eye contact, speech pace and rhythm, muscle tension or ease. It takes all this data and assembles it into an impression that arrives in your consciousness not as a report, but as a feeling. You walk into a meeting and you feel which person is centered and which ones are anxious. You meet someone for the first time and something in you immediately settles or goes on guard. You're not doing this consciously. Your nervous system is doing it because it's been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. This is why you cannot fake presence at the level that matters. You can absolutely fool someone's conscious mind. You can dress right, speak slowly, make perfect gestures, create a convincing impression of calm authority. For a while. But you cannot fool their nervous system. It's not reading your performance, it's reading your state. If your state is anxious, approval-seeking, defended, that signal is present beneath every polished layer. It comes through an imperceptible jaw tension, the slight speed-up in speech when conversation goes unexpected directions, the micro-expression of relief when someone laughs at something you said. These signals are too small and too fast for conscious detection. But they register. They shape how people feel in your presence, which shapes how they treat you, which shapes what you interpret as evidence about your worth. Add to this the neuroscience of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are the neural architecture through which we simulate others' internal states. We literally rehearse the experience of the person we're observing. This is why someone else's laughter makes you laugh, why watching someone in pain creates sympathetic pain, why sitting with an anxious person raises your own heart rate, and critically, why sitting with someone who is genuinely calm, not performing calm, but genuinely inhabiting it, produces in you an involuntary, immediate settling effect. This is the actual mechanism of presence. When you encounter someone whose nervous system is genuinely regulated, someone not managing a performance, not monitoring reactions, not running background impression management, your nervous system picks up that signal. You relax. You feel more at ease. Because of that ease, you attribute to them a quality of authority, warmth, and safety that makes you want to stay near them, trust them, extend respect. The inverse is equally true and important. When you encounter someone whose nervous system is in defended alertness, even if their performance is technically flawless, your nervous system picks up that signal too. You may not feel unsafe, but something in you recognizes that this person is working hard at something. That recognition subtly undermines the impression they're working so hard to create. Effort, at this neurological level, is a tell, like a poker face that twitches at the worst moment. The tell doesn't need to be dramatic to be read. What this means practically: the path to genuine presence is not behavioral. It's physiological and psychological. It runs through actual regulation of your nervous system, through genuine calm rather than performed calm, through actual security rather than the appearance of security, through the slow, unglamorous work of changing your internal relationship with threat, uncertainty, and disapproval. When you genuinely stop treating people's opinions as verdicts on your worth, your nervous system stops generating the threat response that disapproval used to trigger. When that threat response quiets, everything changes. Your voice slows naturally. Your eye contact becomes easy, not effortful. Your body stops holding the subtle tension of someone waiting to be exposed. You become the kind of person whose arrival other people's nervous systems notice and respond to, not because you've mastered techniques, but because you've become, in the most literal neurological sense, someone whose presence feels different from the noise. There's a question that separates how genuinely confident people think from how everyone else thinks. It's not the question you'd expect. It's not, "What should I do?" That's what almost everyone asks in almost every situation. It's not, "How should I respond?" or "What's the right move?" or "How will this be received?" The question genuinely confident people operate from is simpler and more foundational. Who am I? And what does someone like me do here? Not as a performance of identity, as a genuine consultation with a stable internal self that exists independent of context, independent of others' reactions, independent of whether this particular situation is going well or badly. This distinction, identity before action, is the internal architecture that makes confident behavior possible without it being performed. When your sense of who you are is stable and rooted, behavior flows from it naturally. the way water flows downhill. You don't decide whether to be direct. Directness is part of who you are. It simply expresses itself. You don't decide whether to hold your position under pressure. Your position is grounded in your values, rather than in hope that people will agree. Your values don't renegotiate when someone pushes back. You don't decide how much space to take up. A person genuinely at home in themselves takes exactly the space that feels natural, without apology, without overcorrection in either direction. Most people haven't built this stable identity foundation. They've built something else instead, a contextual identity. A sense of self that shifts based on environment, social feedback, the perceived expectations of whoever they're with. They're somewhat different at work than at home, somewhat different with friends than with strangers, somewhat different when things are going well than when they're not. The core of who they are seems to move depending on what the situation seems to call for. Some degree of social adaptability is healthy, necessary even. What I'm describing is different in kind. Not just adapting your communication style, not just having multiple versions available. It's the absence of a center that holds regardless of context. The psychological roots of this run deep. Children who grow up in environments where love and acceptance were conditional on being good enough, likable enough, impressive enough, compliant enough, learn at a formative level that who you are is something you demonstrate rather than something you simply are. Identity becomes a project, something you construct, maintain, defend, rather than something you inhabit with ease. Once that pattern is established, it perpetuates itself. Every time you receive positive feedback for performing a version of yourself, you reinforce the belief that the performance is what earns acceptance, not the self beneath it. The internal experience of someone with a grounded identity is qualitatively different. When they encounter criticism, their first response isn't defense, isn't hurt. It's a genuine internal question. Is this true? They can ask that calmly because their sense of self isn't on trial. The criticism is being evaluated, not the whole edifice of who they are. If the criticism is accurate, they acknowledge and integrate it without drama. If it's unfair or inaccurate, they dismiss it without bitterness. Because the criticism didn't land as an attack on their worth, it landed as information. And information doesn't require defense. When they encounter uncertainty, they don't need to resolve it immediately to feel safe. They can sit with not knowing. They can make decisions in the presence of incomplete information without the anxious urgency that uncertainty usually produces. This capacity to tolerate ambiguity is consistently associated with high-functioning, respected leadership and with the quality of presence that draws people towards someone. Because certainty in an uncertain world is almost always a performance, when they encounter rejection, they feel it. Let's be clear. A grounded identity isn't an anesthetic. Rejection is a social pain signal. That signal is neurologically real. What doesn't happen is the catastrophizing leap. From, I was rejected in this situation, to, I am fundamentally unworthy of belonging. That leap, which for many people happens so fast it feels like a single experience, is what an unstable identity produces. A stable identity feels the rejection and the signal settles. It doesn't echo. It doesn't metastasize into a generalized story about not being enough. Building a stable identity isn't about convincing yourself you're better than you think. Affirmation-based approaches fail exactly here. They try to install a belief from the outside in. The actual work is structural, inside out. A stable identity is built through three things: clarity, knowing what you actually value, not what you've been told to value, not what would be socially impressive to value, but what genuinely matters to you when you're being completely honest. Consistency, behaving in accordance with those values repeatedly over time, especially when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. Accumulated evidence, what you develop when you do both things long enough. A track record visible to no one but you. Proof that you can be counted on to act from your values, even when the situation creates pressure to act from fear. When that track record exists, you know something about yourself that no one else's opinion can touch. And that knowledge is the bedrock of genuine confidence. There's a version of the mind-body connection that's been thoroughly commodified by the confidence industry, and it's worth clearing away the distortion. The marketed version goes like this. Your body can trick your brain into feeling confident. Adopt confident postures and hold them long enough, and the confidence becomes real. The famous power pose hypothesis: adopt physical expansion and your hormones change in ways that cascade into psychological confidence. The original research supporting this has largely failed to replicate. The effect, where it exists at all, is small, brief, and dependent on conditions that rarely hold in real, high-stakes situations. But more fundamentally, the approach is backwards. It treats the body as a tool for manipulating the mind. The actual relationship runs in the opposite direction, and it's far more interesting and useful. Your body isn't a tool for producing mental states. Your body is an expression of mental states. More precisely, it's an expression of your nervous system state, which reflects the cumulative history of your psychological experience in a way that's both deeply accurate and nearly impossible to selectively falsify. The tension in your shoulders, the quality of your breathing, how fast you speak, the degree of fluidity or rigidity in your movement. These aren't choices you make in the moment. They're the physical residue of patterns built since before you had language, the readout of your internal relationship with safety, worth, and the world's basic orientation toward you. This is why the body matters so much in the psychology of confidence, and why it matters almost exactly opposite to what the confidence industry suggests. The work isn't to use the body to manufacture psychological states. The work is to resolve the psychological states being expressed through the body, then let the body change as a consequence. Internal first, external second, always. What does a genuinely confident person's body actually look like? Not in the static posed sense from tutorials, in motion, in conversation, in the dynamic texture of real interaction. It's not necessarily expansive, not necessarily taking up maximum space. What it consistently is across enormous individual variation, unconstricted. The breath moves freely. Movement is neither hurried nor performed slow. The face responds to what's actually happening rather than maintaining a managed expression. The eyes don't work, they just land where they land, rest where they rest, without the calculating quality of someone who's read that eye contact held for exactly the right duration signals dominance. The entire presentation has the quality of someone who isn't thinking about how they appear because they have no pressing need to appear a particular way. Now consider what someone performing confidence actually looks like to those paying attention. The stillness is slightly too deliberate. It has the quality of suppression, not ease. The voice is slightly too controlled. The pace is managed in a way real ease doesn't require. The eye contact is held a beat too long, or broken a beat too soon because it's being calculated. The posture is correct in the way a photograph of correct posture is correct, but it lacks the alive, responsive quality of someone simply inhabiting their own body without self-consciousness. Underneath it all, if you're perceptive enough, there's the faint quality of effort, the barely perceptible strain of someone maintaining something rather than simply being something. The somatic experience of genuine confidence is worth examining because it's likely unfamiliar to people who've been in performance mode most of their social lives. It feels like softness in places that are usually held. It feels like breath that moves all the way down into the belly rather than catching in the chest. It feels like a slight slowing of interior pace. The interior monologue quiets, or at least becomes less frantic, because there's less to manage. There's a quality of being at home in your own body that's difficult to describe precisely, but immediately recognizable once experienced. It's so different from the constant low-grade tension of someone monitoring external reactions and adjusting their presentation. The autonomic nervous system operates through two primary modes: the sympathetic mode, the threat response, the system that mobilizes you for fight, flight, or freeze. The parasympathetic mode, the rest and connect state. Genuine ease and openness. Most people in most social situations, particularly high-stakes ones, are operating in some degree of sympathetic activation. Their nervous system has tagged the social environment as containing potential threat. The threat of rejection, humiliation, not being enough, and it's responding accordingly. In socially sophisticated adults, the physical correlates are subtle but present. Elevated muscle tension, slightly elevated heart rate, slightly elevated speech pace, narrowing of peripheral attention, reduction in spontaneity and fluidity of expression. The people who command respect effortlessly are in these same situations operating in or near parasympathetic mode. Not because they're not perceiving the social situation accurately, not because they're indifferent to outcomes, but because the social situation doesn't register as a threat, the possibility that others might think less of them, that the interaction might go badly, that they might be judged unfavorably. These possibilities exist in their awareness, but they don't activate the threat response. Because they've developed through genuine psychological work, not through technique, a relationship with those possibilities that doesn't require them to be avoided at all costs. The outcome matters to them, but their well-being isn't contingent on it. And that independence, that parasympathetic ease in the face of genuine social uncertainty, is what their bodies broadcast. It's what other people's nervous systems pick up. It's what creates the experience of being in the presence of someone substantial, someone grounded, someone who commands respect without demanding it. The practical implication: work on your nervous system before you work on your behavior. Work on your actual relationship with uncertainty, rejection, and disapproval before you work on how you hold your body or modulate your voice. Not because behavior doesn't matter. It does. But behavior flowing from a regulated nervous system is categorically different from behavior imposed on top of a dysregulated one. The former feels like a person. The latter, no matter how polished, feels like a presentation. In the economy of human respect, that difference is everything. There's a category error running through almost every popular conversation about confidence and social authority. It's responsible for some of the most counterproductive advice ever given on the subject. The error is treating respect and fear as points on a continuum, as though the path to being respected runs through being feared, as though authority is dominance that's been refined and made palatable. This error is everywhere. It shows up in advice to be more aggressive in negotiations, never apologize, hold eye contact past the point of comfort, speak less and let silence intimidate. All of this conflates two fundamentally different social phenomena. Fear and respect are not points on the same spectrum. They're entirely different experiences that produce entirely different social dynamics. When someone fears you, their nervous system has tagged you as a source of potential harm. Their behavior is organized around threat management, around not triggering whatever makes you dangerous, around reducing their vulnerability to you, around compliance as survival strategy. People who are feared are obeyed in the short term and avoided, undermined, or actively worked against the moment the threat is removed. The respect fear generates isn't respect at all. It's performance of respect, a mimicry of deference designed to minimize harm. It's deeply unstable, entirely contingent on maintenance of the threat, and corrosive to every relationship and environment it touches. Genuine respect is categorically different. It's a voluntary attribution of worth. When someone genuinely respects you, their behavior isn't organized around threat management. It's organized around recognition that you bring something real to the interaction, that your judgment is worth weighing, that your character is reliable in ways that matter. Genuine respect is stable in a way fear compliance never is. It doesn't depend on threat maintenance. It persists in your absence. It extends to contexts where you have no power. It generates loyalty, advocacy, and social trust that compounds over time into actual influence. The psychological signature of someone who commands genuine respect is precisely opposite what the dominance framework suggests. Genuine respect is commanded by those who make others feel seen, not small. By those who extend genuine recognition without needing anything in return. By those whose apologies, when they come, carry the full weight of accountability, rather than the hollow form of social ritual. The most deeply respected people are almost universally those who've made others feel genuinely regarded. Not as props in someone else's status performance, but as actual human beings whose presence matters. This is the mechanism that people chasing status through dominance never understand. Status in human groups isn't assigned based on who can most convincingly project superiority. It's assigned based on who contributes most reliably to the group's functioning and well-being. The research on status hierarchies in social groups is consistent. The individuals who attain the highest sustainable status are those who combine competence with generosity. Those with genuine capability who use it in ways that benefit others. The pure dominance display, the status claim not backed by genuine contribution, generates compliance in the moment and resentment over time. It's status that has to be continuously defended because it was never genuinely earned. This distinction between earned and performed status matters enormously for understanding confidence that commands respect. People who command deep, lasting respect aren't engaged in status competition. They're not tracking where they sit in the hierarchy relative to others. They're not calculating whether a particular statement or behavior will raise or lower their perceived social position. These calculations, which consume enormous amounts of cognitive and emotional energy in people caught in dominance-based status games, simply aren't running in the background for them. And the absence of those calculations is itself a status signal, perhaps the most powerful one available. Because the person not competing for status is implicitly communicating that they don't need to. That communication lands with tremendous force, and it lands as respect, not as threat. The fastest way to lose status is to try to take it. The fastest way to gain genuine authority is to stop organizing your behavior around acquiring it. This doesn't mean becoming passive or allowing yourself to be treated badly. It means understanding that the authority you command is a byproduct of who you are and what you contribute, not a prize to be won through the right combination of social moves. When you're genuinely excellent at something, when your character is genuinely reliable, when your presence is genuinely oriented toward others rather than toward managing their impression of you, the status that results doesn't need to be defended. It's simply acknowledged because it reflects something real. And something real doesn't require performance. Most people are afraid of silence in social situations. Not mildly uncomfortable, genuinely afraid. Silence in conversation feels like a gap that needs filling, a problem that needs solving, a signal that something has gone wrong. The moment a pause extends past what feels comfortable, most people experience a spike of anxiety and reflexively reach for words, for something to say, for any contribution that fills the gap and restores flow. They do this not because they have something they want to say, but because the silence itself has become the problem. This relationship with silence is one of the most reliable tells in the social repertoire of someone operating from psychological insecurity. It matters for the psychology of confidence for a reason running much deeper than comfort. The discomfort with silence is discomfort with loss of control over the impression forming in the other person's mind. When you're talking, you're managing the narrative. You're supplying the information from which the other person constructs their impression of you. When you're silent, that management stops. The other person is left with whatever they've already observed. You have no further influence over what they make of it. For someone whose social safety depends on continuous impression management, this is genuinely threatening. And so they speak not from abundance, but from anxiety, filling silence with words that often undermine the exact impression they're trying to protect. The genuinely confident person has a fundamentally different relationship with silence. If your sense of worth doesn't depend on what the other person is currently thinking of you, then what they're currently thinking isn't a matter of acute concern. The silence doesn't represent loss of control over a process you needed to control in the first place. It represents a moment in which nothing in particular needs to happen, and therefore nothing in particular needs to be said. This ease with the absence of verbal output is one of the most direct, most readable expressions of genuine psychological security in social interaction. The social effects of this ease with silence are significant and multi-layered. The most obvious: it enables genuine listening. Someone not anxious about silence isn't formulating their next contribution during the listening portion of the conversation, isn't half attending to the other person's words while running a parallel process that prepares a response. They're simply listening fully, with undivided attention, without the background hum of performance anxiety. And the experience of being genuinely listened to is so rare and so impactful that it creates in the person being heard an immediate, powerful, positive attribution toward the listener. People don't experience genuine listening often. When they do, they remember it. They describe the listener as unusually intelligent, unusually warm, unusually trustworthy. They want to speak with them again. They extend almost automatically the kind of respect that years of talking at people could never earn. A second effect is the quality of thought that silence permits in conversation. People who feel compelled to fill silence rarely give themselves time to think carefully before speaking. They say the first thing that arrives because silence is the problem, and any words solve it. The result is conversational contribution that's often imprecise, often unnecessary, often slightly at variance with what the person actually thinks. Over time, this pattern creates a reputation for shallowness that the person doesn't understand because, from the inside, they don't experience themselves as shallow. They experience themselves as someone trying hard to keep conversation going. What they don't see is that the trying hard is the problem. The effort itself is the signal that undermines them. The person who allows silence to exist, who takes a moment before responding to something complex, who doesn't experience a 3-second pause as a social emergency, produces something qualitatively different in their conversational contributions. Their words are more precise, more considered, more genuinely reflective of their actual thinking. When they do speak, what they say carries more weight. Not because they've worked to make it weightier, but because the silence that preceded it communicated that it was worth the wait. This is one of the mechanisms through which the quiet person in the room is often the most influential. It's not that quietness is intrinsically powerful. It's that the specific kind of quietness coming from genuine ease rather than social withdrawal produces, by contrast with the ambient noise of anxious social performance, a quality of signal to noise that commands attention. There's also a third, more subtle effect. Silence creates space. And space in social interaction is a gift that most people never offer, and almost everyone is hungry for. Most social environments are saturated with verbal output. Most conversations are dense with speaking with the collective, largely unconscious effort to keep the stream of words flowing, as though the words themselves are what make the interaction valuable. Into this density, genuine silence is unusual enough to be remarkable. The person who can sit comfortably in that space, who doesn't need to fill it, who offers their conversational partner the rare experience of a pause that feels restful rather than awkward. That person is doing something unusual. They're creating conditions in which genuine thought, genuine connection, genuine exchange becomes possible. And because those conditions are rare, the person who creates them becomes associated with them. They become someone people want to be in conversation with. Not because of the brilliance of their output, but because of the quality of the experience their presence creates. Learning to befriend silence isn't a technique. It's not something you can simply decide to do from the outside. The discomfort with silence won't yield to instruction. What it yields to is the same thing that every other symptom of approval seeking yields to: genuine development of a more settled relationship with your own worth. When you're not waiting for the other person to confirm that you're interesting and valuable, you don't need to supply them with continuous evidence. You can simply be in the conversation, attending fully, speaking when you have something to say, resting in the space when you don't. And that simplicity, that freedom from the compulsion to perform, that's the foundation of the most powerful communication anyone can offer. The word boundaries has been so thoroughly processed by modern self-help that it's become almost meaningless. A soft, therapeutic term most people associate with conflict avoidance, with assertiveness training, with relationship management strategy. What it's lost in processing is its actual psychological content. Real psychological limits, the ones that emerge naturally from a stable sense of who you are and what you will and won't accept, aren't a relationship management strategy. They're not a communication technique. They're the most direct possible expression of self-respect. And whether you have genuine self-respect is the single most important determinant of how much respect you command from others. Real limits aren't rules you set after careful deliberation about what's healthy. They emerge from something simpler and more fundamental: knowing what matters to you. Being clear about what you'll and won't participate in. Being willing to act on that clarity even when it's uncomfortable. When someone has a genuine psychological limit, they don't experience a moment of violation and then decide whether to enforce it. The limit is already there, prior to any decision, because it reflects something real about who they are. Their response to having it crossed isn't primarily strategic. It's simply the natural consequence of being someone who doesn't participate in certain things. This is the crucial distinction between genuine limits and performed limits, between actual self-respect and the assertiveness that training manuals teach. Performed assertiveness, the kind coming from instruction rather than genuine self-regard, has a quality that sensitive observers always detect. It's slightly too deliberate. It comes with slightly too careful articulation of what's acceptable, as though the person is reading from a script memorized in a workshop. It carries the faint quality of someone who's decided, perhaps correctly, that they've been too accommodating and is now implementing a correction. The correction may be necessary and healthy, but it doesn't produce the social effect of genuine limits because it doesn't have the same psychological roots. Genuine limits produce a specific social effect that performed assertiveness can't replicate. When you encounter someone with genuine psychological limits, someone who knows clearly what they will and won't accept and doesn't make a performance of that knowledge, you experience them as having a particular quality of solidity. You know, without being told explicitly, that there are certain things they won't do, certain treatments they won't accept, certain compromises they won't make. And this knowledge, which you absorb from dozens of small behavioral signals rather than from explicit statement, creates a specific kind of respect. Not fear, not intimidation, a recognition that this person has a center that won't shift under pressure, that dealing with them honestly is both possible and necessary, because dealing dishonestly won't produce the outcomes that dishonesty usually produces with more compliant people. The willingness to walk away is perhaps the purest expression of genuine limits. Most people experience the willingness to walk away from something, a negotiation, a relationship, an opportunity, as a loss, a concession of defeat, the end of a possibility they were invested in. And when it comes from impulsive reaction or wounded pride, it often is. But when it comes from genuine psychological clarity, when it reflects a person's honest assessment that this situation, relationship, or arrangement can't be what they actually need it to be, it's one of the most powerful signals a person can send, because it communicates in terms that can't be misread that this person's participation is conditional on certain things being true, that their presence is a choice they make based on whether the situation serves genuine needs, not a position they desperately need to maintain. That communication changes the entire dynamic, because it transfers the fundamental anxiety from the person with limits to the person who depends on their continued participation. This isn't a power game. It's important to be clear. The willingness to walk away I'm describing isn't a tactic for leverage, not a negotiation strategy, not a move designed to make yourself more valued by manufacturing scarcity. The real version has none of that strategic overlay. It's simply the honest expression of someone who knows what they need and is willing to go without the thing in front of them rather than participate in a version that doesn't meet that standard. The source isn't strategy. It's a deep enough sense of their own worth that going without feels less costly than compromising. The relationship between genuine limits and confidence runs in both directions. On one side, genuine confidence, the settled internal relationship with your own worth, is what makes genuine limits possible. You can't hold limits under social pressure if your sense of self-worth is contingent on the approval of the person applying the pressure. Every time you need something from someone, your ability to refuse them is compromised by that need. Only a self that doesn't require their validation can hold its ground when their approval is at stake. On the other side, consistently holding genuine limits, repeatedly acting in accordance with what you actually value even when it costs something, builds the internal evidence of your own reliability to yourself that genuine confidence rests on. Every time you hold a limit that mattered, you demonstrate to the part of yourself that's always watching and cataloging your behavior that you can be counted on to treat your own worth seriously. The two things grow together. There's a phrase circulating in self-help that's become almost a cliché. What other people think of you is none of your business. The reason it's become a cliché is that it sounds exactly right and feels impossible to implement. Most people hearing it recognize the wisdom immediately, nod in agreement, then return to monitoring what others think with the same anxious consistency as before. The phrase doesn't change anything because it doesn't address the mechanism. And the mechanism is what needs to be understood. What other people think of you isn't something you can simply decide not to care about, the way you might decide not to check your phone during a meeting. The monitoring of social opinion isn't a choice, it's a function. It runs automatically, continuously. And it's been running so long and so consistently that it feels like consciousness itself rather than a learned pattern. The question isn't whether to stop caring. That instruction is useless. The question is what the caring actually is, why it has the power it has, and what conditions allow it to lose that power. At its root, caring what others think is a threat response. It activates the same neurological system that responds to physical danger. The same system that accelerates your heartbeat when a car comes too close. The same system that floods your body with cortisol when you perceive you're under attack. The reason social opinion activates a threat response is that for the vast majority of human evolutionary history, social exclusion was genuinely life-threatening. Being rejected by your group meant losing access to resources, protection, and cooperation that survival depended on. The brain that treated social disapproval as a minor inconvenience was less likely to take the corrective action necessary to maintain group membership, and therefore less likely to survive. We're the descendants of people who took social disapproval seriously. Seriously enough that the machinery for doing so is deeply embedded in our neurological architecture, running below conscious control. Treating every social rejection as though it might be the one that costs everything. This is why the instruction to simply stop caring feels impossible. You're not dealing with a preference. You're dealing with a threat detection system calibrated for a social environment radically different from the one you actually inhabit. In the environment you actually inhabit, social disapproval is almost never life-threatening. Most social rejection results in discomfort, sometimes significant, but not in the loss of survival-critical resources. The person in the meeting responding coolly to your idea isn't expelling you from the tribe. The stranger not returning your smile isn't withdrawing the group's protection. But your nervous system doesn't make these distinctions automatically. It responds with the same threat response it would deploy for physical danger, because the mechanism predates the modern social environment by hundreds of thousands of years. Understanding this doesn't immediately resolve the problem. The threat response doesn't stand down simply because you've recognized it as evolutionarily outdated. But it does something important. It changes the meaning of the experience. When you feel the spike of anxiety that comes from sensing disapproval, and you understand that what you're feeling isn't an accurate signal about your worth, but a very old alarm system firing in response to a stimulus it was never calibrated to distinguish from genuine threat, that understanding creates a sliver of space between the feeling and your response to it. That sliver of space is where genuine change begins. The shift that eventually allows people to actually stop being governed by social opinion, not to stop feeling it, but to stop being governed by it, is a shift in what social opinion represents at the deepest level. For most people, what someone else thinks is experienced as evidence about what they actually are. Praise feels like confirmation of worth. Criticism feels like exposure of unworthiness. A neutral response feels like a verdict on belonging. Social feedback is being processed as though it's objective information about your value, as though other people have accurate access to your actual worth, and their opinions reflect that reliably. But other people's opinions aren't objective information about your value. They're information about the observer, about their current state, their biases, their history, their needs, their preoccupations, their capacity for generosity or pettiness. In this particular moment, the person who dislikes you is telling you something about what kind of people they tend to dislike, what qualities make them uncomfortable, what their framework treats as unwelcome. The person who admires you is telling you what they're primed to find admirable, what qualities their history taught them to value, what they're hoping to find in you. Neither is objective, neither is a verdict. Both are simply a viewpoint, as specific and contingent as every other viewpoint, as colored by the particularities of the observer as any other act of perception. When this becomes genuinely real to you, not as an intellectual position but as lived experience of how social feedback actually works, the grip of other people's opinions begins to loosen. Not because you've become indifferent to others, but because you've stopped treating their opinions as the trial in which your worth is being determined. You begin to receive social feedback the way you might receive weather. Real, worth noting, occasionally relevant to decisions you need to make, but not something that changes the fundamental nature of the reality it touches. The weather doesn't tell you what you actually are. Neither does what other people think of you. There's a principle operating in social dynamics with remarkable consistency across cultures, contexts, and every spectrum of human social environments. The person in the room who is least emotionally reactive tends to have the most social authority. This isn't about coldness, not about suppression of emotion, not about performance of unmovability. It's about something much more specific and much more interesting. The relationship between emotional regulation and social trust, and why the capacity to remain psychologically grounded under pressure is one of the most reliably respected human qualities that exists. To understand why, think about what emotional dysregulation does in social situations. When someone's emotional response to a situation is disproportionate, when the reaction is larger, more intense, more sustained than the situation actually warrants, several things happen simultaneously. The dysregulated person's attention narrows sharply, focusing on the emotional experience and the situation that produced it at the expense of everything else. Their access to nuanced thinking diminishes because neurological resources supporting complex reasoning are partially commandeered by the emotional response. Their behavior becomes less predictable because it's now driven by the emotional state rather than considered intention. And the people around them are pulled, whether they want to be or not, into a relationship with the dysregulation. They must respond to it, manage it, navigate around it, or absorb its impact. The emotional dysregulation becomes the central fact of the social situation, regardless of what the situation was supposed to be about. This dynamic has a profound effect on social authority. People can't simultaneously manage their response to your emotional state and genuinely engage with what you're trying to communicate or accomplish. When you're dysregulated, the emotional state becomes the agenda, and when your emotional state consistently becomes the agenda, you lose the authority of someone whose actual thoughts, judgments, and intentions shape the course of events. You become someone who needs to be handled, rather than someone genuinely directing anything. The handling may be done with care and affection, but it's a fundamentally different social position from someone whose emotional responses are reliable and proportionate enough that others can simply engage with them. The person who remains emotionally regulated under pressure, under criticism, under uncertainty, under conflict, under the specific social pressure of being disagreed with or actively challenged, demonstrates something immediately and deeply registered by everyone present. They demonstrate that the situation doesn't have the power to move them from their center. Not because they don't care. The regulated person often cares deeply, sometimes more deeply than the dysregulated person, but because their caring doesn't have the structure of an emergency. Their access to their own values and judgments isn't impaired by emotional flooding. They can want something strongly without experiencing failure to get it as a catastrophe. They can be challenged without that challenge activating the threat response that reorganizes their entire psychological functioning around defense. This capacity is learnable, It's not inherent. It's not a personality trait some people have and others don't. It's a skill, a deeply learnable, deeply developmental skill that builds through specific kinds of experience and specific practice. The neurological basis is well understood. The regulation of emotional response in social situations depends primarily on the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, which modulates the amygdala's threat response and provides the context and judgment that allows initial emotional signals to be processed rather than simply discharged. The prefrontal cortex's capacity for this regulation isn't fixed. It can be developed. And it's developed through practice. Through repeatedly encountering situations that activate emotional response and practicing in those situations the pause that allows prefrontal processing to occur before behavior follows. The development of this capacity is inseparable from the development of genuine confidence because the conditions producing emotional dysregulation are almost identical to those undermining genuine confidence. At the root of both is the same vulnerability, a sense of self contingent on external conditions. When your sense of worth depends on being agreed with, approved of, treated a certain way, seen accurately, then situations violating those conditions generate not just normal disappointment, but something more acute. A threat to the basis on which you understand yourself to be okay. And threats to your psychological foundation produce threat responses, which produce emotional dysregulation, which produce the loss of social authority. The inverse is equally true and important. As your sense of self becomes less contingent on external conditions, as you build the internal stability that genuine confidence rests on, your vulnerability to emotional dysregulation in response to social pressure reduces naturally. Not because you feel less, but because less of what you feel carries the weight of existential threat. Criticism stops feeling like assault on your worth and starts feeling like information about how one person perceives one aspect of your output. Disagreement stops feeling like rejection of your legitimacy and starts feeling like the normal condition of independent thinkers having different conclusions. Conflict stops being something to avoid at significant cost and starts being something to navigate with whatever combination of firmness and flexibility the situation calls for. The social authority resulting from this emotional regulation is the authority of someone who is genuinely calm, genuinely able to think clearly, speak precisely, hold position without rigidity or collapse in exactly the situations where others' emotional flooding has removed those capacities from their disposal. In a room where everyone else is reacting, the person who's responding tends to determine what actually happens. Not because they've claimed leadership, not because they have the highest title or loudest voice, but because they have the most reliable access to judgment. And judgment under pressure is what everyone in the room is silently looking for someone to provide. There's a form of confidence that requires no psychology, no internal work, no reconstruction of your relationship with approval, uncertainty, or opinion. It requires exactly one thing: genuine mastery of something that matters. When you've spent long enough in serious pursuit of a craft, a discipline, a body of knowledge or skill, long enough that your capability in that domain is no longer a matter of hope or performance, but of demonstrated, accumulated, undeniable fact, the confidence emerging from that mastery has a quality that's categorically different from everything else. It's not dependent on how others respond to you. It's not contingent on social conditions being favorable. It's not something that can be taken away by a dismissive comment or social rejection, or a room full of people who haven't yet recognized what you bring. It lives in the same place as the mastery itself, in the body of work, in the accumulated hours, in the results that exist independent of whether anyone acknowledges them. It's in the deepest sense yours. The relationship between genuine competence and genuine confidence is structural, not merely correlational. When you've developed real mastery in a domain, you possess something that functions as an internal standard of self-evaluation independent of external feedback. You know when your work is good not because someone told you so, but because you've developed through sustained engagement the capacity to evaluate it accurately yourself. You know when your judgment in your domain is sound, not because it was validated by others, but because you've tested it against reality enough times to have calibrated it. You've built an internal reference point, a reliable, evidence-based sense of your own capability that doesn't require continuous external confirmation to remain stable. And that internal reference point is one of the most durable foundations for genuine psychological confidence that exists. This is the confidence that cannot be faked, not because people can see through the bluff, though they often can, but for a more fundamental reason. It cannot be performed from the outside in because it doesn't originate in behavior. It originates in the accumulated, irreversible fact of having done the work. The person who spent 10,000 hours in genuine pursuit of a craft doesn't decide to be confident about that craft. The confidence is simply a byproduct of what they know about themselves and what they've built. The same way a bridge's strength is a byproduct of how it was engineered, not of how confidently the engineers describe it. The social effect of this mastery-rooted confidence is distinct and immediately perceptible. The person genuinely expert at something has a specific quality in the domain of their expertise, recognizable even to people who don't share the expertise. It's a quality of ease, not the performed ease of someone who's decided to appear relaxed, but the functional ease of someone for whom a large portion of the cognitive and psychological work has become automatic. They don't have to think about the fundamentals because they're internalized. They don't have to calculate basic moves because they're long since become available without effort. Their attention, freed from the overhead novices must spend on basics, is available for the genuinely interesting, genuinely complex aspects. And this availability, this capacity to engage with fine-grained, high-level, genuinely difficult aspects while foundations operate automatically beneath them, is perceptible. People can feel the difference between someone navigating a domain and someone inhabiting it.
What's less commonly understood is that genuine mastery begins to generalize, not in the superficial sense that skill in one area transfers directly to unrelated areas. It doesn't, not in any reliable way. But the psychological byproducts of mastery begin to transfer. The internal standard for self-evaluation, the comfort with process, the capacity to tolerate not yet knowing as a necessary precondition for eventual knowing. The relationship with failure as data rather than verdict. These things do begin to transfer. The person who's developed genuine mastery in their domain has lived inside that domain all the experiences that psychological confidence requires. They've failed repeatedly and continued. They've been uncertain and stayed with the uncertainty rather than resolving it prematurely. They've been worse than others for long periods and trusted that sustained effort would eventually change that. They've produced work they knew wasn't yet good enough and brought it back to try again. These experiences accumulated in one domain build a psychological architecture that shapes how the person relates to difficulty, uncertainty, and failure across the full range of their life. This is why genuinely excellent people, those who've built real mastery, often have a quality of presence and confidence that exceeds what you'd expect from their explicit skills alone. It's because mastery has built more than skill. It's built a psychological structure reflecting what sustained, honest effort in service of genuine growth actually does to a person over time. It teaches you, at a level below conceptual understanding, that you can trust yourself to stay with something difficult. That discomfort in the learning curve isn't a signal of failure, but a feature of the process. That the gap between where you are and where you want to be isn't a fixed statement about your ceiling, but a temporary condition that effort changes. These lessons learned through direct experience rather than instruction become the bedrock of a confidence that doesn't require favorable conditions to hold. The practical implication here is uncomfortable for those seeking psychological shortcuts to confidence. There is no substitute for mastery-based confidence. You cannot think your way to it. You cannot meditate or affirm your way to it. You cannot reframe your way to it. The only path is through the work itself. Through sustained, honest, often unglamorous engagement with something genuinely difficult for long enough that capability becomes real. This is ultimately hopeful because it means the confidence you're chasing isn't arbitrary or mysterious. It's the direct and predictable consequence of doing something real with genuine commitment for long enough. It waits on the other side of the work. And the work, though demanding, has a direction that nothing else in confidence pursuit can offer. If everything covered so far is accurate, and the evidence both empirical and experiential is overwhelming, then the central practical question isn't whether you need to reduce dependency on external validation. That's answered. The question is how. How do you systematically dismantle something woven into the architecture of your daily experience? Something operating below conscious control. Something built over decades and that your nervous system treats as a survival mechanism. The answer isn't a single technique. It's not affirmations to recite or visualization or a morning routine repositioning your mindset before you encounter others. These approaches fail not because intentions are wrong, but because they attempt to address a deep structural pattern through surface-level intervention. Approval dependency isn't a bad habit like nail-biting or excessive phone use. It's a fundamental organizing principle of your psychological architecture. Dismantling it requires working at the level of that architecture, not at the level of individual behaviors or daily rituals. The first element is extended, honest self-observation. Not the self-observation of someone who's decided they need to change and is now monitoring violations, but more neutral, patient observation of someone simply wanting to understand accurately how the pattern operates in them. What specific social situations most reliably activate your approval seeking? Situations involving authority figures? Situations where your competence is evaluated? Situations where you're the new person, the outsider? Situations involving potential romantic interest? Situations where you've said something and wait to see how it lands. The pattern isn't uniform across contexts. It has specific triggers, specific textures, specific behavioral expressions personal to you. You need to know them with precision before you can work with them effectively. This requires a quality of honesty most people resist because behaviors emerging from approval seeking are often explained in more flattering terms. The person talking too much isn't anxiously filling silence. They're contributing enthusiastically. They're engaged, bringing energy. The person agreeing beyond their actual views isn't abandoning authenticity for approval. They're being open-minded, seeing merit in other viewpoints, avoiding unnecessary conflict. These narratives aren't always wrong. Genuine enthusiasm and genuine open-mindedness are real, but they can be covers for approval seeking you don't want to see clearly. The second element is beginning deliberate, graduated exposure to disapproval in low-stakes contexts. This sounds clinical, but the principle is straightforward and physiologically grounded. The threat response disapproval triggers is subject to habituation. If you repeatedly encounter the stimulus in conditions where the catastrophic outcome doesn't occur, the response gradually recalibrates. Your nervous system learns through direct experience, not through instruction, that disapproval is survivable. More than survivable, it's simply an event that the world continues, that you remain intact, that nothing of genuine importance is actually lost. This learning can't happen through reasoning. It has to happen through experience, which means you create experiences where you risk disapproval and observe what actually follows. You say things you actually think in situations where you'd previously calculated what was most likely approved of. You maintain positions under moderate pressure where you'd previously accommodated. You allow disappointment without rushing to repair it before you've felt what it's like and observed that it's bearable. You decline things you'd have agreed to from need rather than genuine desire to help. Each small act of divergence is neurologically a small dose of exposure therapy. Each adds to accumulating evidence that disapproval isn't the catastrophe predicted. The third element is developing a relationship with your own evaluation of yourself that's rigorous and honest enough to serve as a genuine alternative to external feedback. Most people dependent on external validation have, to some important extent, vacated their own judgment seat. They've stopped trusting their own assessment of their work, character, decisions. Partly because internal assessment was never trained to be reliable, partly because external feedback became the primary calibration source so early that internal calibration was never fully developed. The result is a vacuum where self-knowledge should be. External validation rushes in to fill it. Filling that vacuum requires building genuine self-knowledge, Specific, evidence-based understanding of what you actually value, what you're actually good at, where genuine weaknesses lie, what behavior you can honestly be proud of, what behavior you can't. This isn't the same as positive self-talk. Positive self-talk fills the vacuum with pleasant noise. Genuine self-knowledge fills it with something true, far more durable. When you know with specificity what your actual values are and can point to actual behavioral evidence that you act on them, external verdicts on your worth become genuinely less important. Not because you've decided they should be, but because you have a more reliable source of information. You have an interior standard your behavior can be evaluated against. That standard belongs to you in a way other people's opinions never can. The approval dependency took decades to build. Dismantling it meaningfully takes years of consistent practice, not dramatic transformation moments, not retreats or breakthroughs, but steady, unglamorous accumulation of experiences in which you chose authenticity over approval and discovered repeatedly that the sky didn't fall. The confidence resulting from this accumulation is unlike anything manufactured from the outside in. It's quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It's not booming self-assurance of someone convinced they're great. It's the settled ease of someone who's stopped needing to be convinced of anything about themselves at all. The most socially respected people in any environment are almost never the most polished, not the most carefully managed in self-presentation, not the most skilled at calibrating output to the expectations of the room, not the most practiced at saying exactly what's most likely to land well with exactly this audience in exactly this moment. What they consistently are, almost without exception, is the most honest. Not honest in the blunt, unfiltered sense of someone who's decided candor is a license to be careless with others' feelings. Honest in a more precise and more demanding sense. Willing to say what they actually think, to hold positions that are genuinely their own, to acknowledge things that are uncomfortable to acknowledge, to tell the room what it needs to hear, even when what it needs differs significantly from what it wants. This is social courage. And social courage is among the rarest qualities in human social life, which is precisely why it commands such disproportionate respect when it appears. The rarity isn't accidental. Social courage is rare because it directly challenges the approval-seeking mechanism governing most people's behavior in most social situations. Every time you say something true that might be unwelcome, every time you maintain a position the room is pushing back against, every time you name an uncomfortable reality everyone's been avoiding, every time you give feedback serving growth rather than momentary comfort, you're risking disapproval. You're risking that people will think less of you, that the social transaction won't go smoothly, that you'll be the person who made things difficult rather than the one who made things easy. The approval-seeking mechanism treats these as threats and generates discomfort, the pull toward accommodation, the impulse to say what sounds better even if less true, to manage the social surface rather than engage honestly with substance. Social performance is the alternative the approval-seeking mechanism produces when social courage is too costly. It's careful management of output to maximize approval, calibration of what you say, how you say it, when you agree, when you tactfully redirect rather than directly disagree. The whole elaborate apparatus of impression management most people operate continuously without recognizing as performance at all. Social performance isn't necessarily dishonest in any dramatic sense. It doesn't always involve saying things you know to be false. More often, it involves saying things technically true but selectively chosen for palatability. Agreeing with things you're not fully convinced by, rather than registering reservation. Staying silent where speaking would be honest but might create friction. It's dishonesty of omission, emphasis, selective truth-telling. Honest on the surface about what's welcome over what's real. The social cost of sustained performance is substantial and accumulates invisibly because people normalize the cost. The most obvious, it costs trust. Genuine trust, the kind making people bring you real problems, give honest reactions, rely on you when stakes are high, requires belief that what you're getting is actually what they think, not a version shaped for well reception. When people sense, and perceptive people always sense, even if they can't name it, that your output is managed, that what you say is filtered through calculation about how it will land, the trust available is inherently limited. You can be trusted to be pleasant, agreeable, competent at social navigation. You can't be trusted to tell them something important when telling might cost you. And the trust that actually matters, the trust generating deep respect and genuine reliance, is precisely that second kind. A second cost is relationship depth over time. Relationships where both parties manage output rather than express actual experience remain at certain depth, comfortable, perhaps pleasant, but fundamentally shallow in that people don't truly know each other. They know managed versions, edited for palatability, shaped to maintain social surface. These relationships can last years and feel satisfying in certain moods, but don't survive moments requiring genuine knowing, difficult decisions, real crises, moments when what's needed is someone who'll tell you the truth even when it's hard. Relationships built on performance lack those resources, because performance trades the depth honest engagement builds for the smoothness managed engagement produces. The transition from social performance to social courage is not a single decision. It's a practice beginning in the smallest register. You don't start by telling the most powerful person in your world something they don't want to hear in the year's highest stakes meeting. You start by noticing in low-stakes conversations the moments when what you're about to say has been shaped by how it will be received rather than what you actually think. You start by pausing in those moments, not to dramatically override the performance impulse, but simply to notice it's operating. Then gradually, in situations where social cost is low enough to be bearable, you choose the honest response over the managed one. You offer the reservation you'd have kept to yourself. You maintain the position you'd have quietly abandoned under resistance. You name the thing everyone's working around. What you discover in almost every case is that the response isn't what the approval-seeking mechanism predicted. People don't reject you for honesty. More often, they do the opposite. They engage more deeply, trust you more readily, bring you real things rather than polished things, because they've experienced you as someone who can handle real things. The social courage that felt costly before attempting turns out more often than not to be the thing that actually builds the relationships and reputation the performance was trying to manufacture. Not because honesty is a strategy for earning trust. It's not a strategy at all when genuine, but because it's what trust is actually made of. And what trust is made of tends to produce what trust is made of. There's a law operating in how people are treated by others. It has the reliability of a physical law, even though it belongs entirely to psychology and social dynamics. The standards you hold for how you're treated become, over time, the standards others apply when treating you. Not because you enforce them through confrontation, not through explicit statement, but because the accumulated, consistent expression of those standards in your behavior trains people around you, gradually, thoroughly, often without conscious awareness, in exactly what is and isn't acceptable in relationship with you. You teach people how to treat you primarily through what you accept, what you refuse, what you let pass without comment, what you address, what you reward with your continued presence, what you withdraw from. These lessons are the ones that actually land. They land at the level that actually changes behavior. This is the compounding effect of self-respect. Understanding it fully changes how you understand social dynamics that shaped your relationships and standing in every environment you inhabit. The person accepting dismissiveness because confronting it feels more costly than absorbing it isn't simply making a single pragmatic decision in a difficult moment. They're sending a signal, quiet, consistent, accumulated over time, that dismissiveness is a cost they'll bear in exchange for continued belonging. That signal is received, incorporated into the other person's model of the relationship, and shapes their subsequent behavior. Not necessarily through deliberate calculation, often entirely without their awareness, but through the simple psychological mechanism by which relationship behavior is shaped by what relationships demonstrate they will tolerate. The inverse operates with equal consistency and force. The person who, without drama or explicit statement, consistently responds to dismissiveness by withdrawing engagement rather than absorbing the cost. Who maintains a standard for how they're addressed that is calm, non-aggressive, but real. Sends an equally consistent signal. That signal trains people around them in different expectations. Over time, without single confrontation, without dramatic assertion of standards or explicit renegotiation, the social environment shifts to reflect what they've consistently demonstrated they will and won't accept. Relationships that remain meet the standard. Relationships that can't tend gradually and without crisis to reduce in intimacy and frequency, reflecting genuine mismatch. The social environment becomes a reflection of the standard held consistently. What's compounding about this effect is its operation across time in a way that makes early choices disproportionately consequential. Standards established or failed to establish in early relationship stages tend to persist and intensify over time because they set the baseline from which all subsequent interactions are evaluated by both parties. When you establish early, through consistent behavior rather than explicit statement, that you're someone who engages seriously and expects serious engagement, that you bring genuine quality and expect genuine respect for it, that your time and attention are genuinely valuable and therefore not available without limit to whoever would consume them without reciprocation. These standards become embedded in the relationship structure. They become part of what this relationship is. Changing them later requires active renegotiation that maintaining them from the beginning never required. The deepest dimension of this effect is internal. Every time you act in accordance with genuine self-respect standards, every time you withdraw from situations treating your worth as negotiable, every time you decline something asking you to compromise what matters, every time you hold what you know to be true under social pressure to agree with something you don't believe, you're not simply influencing how others will treat you. You're adding to internal evidence that you can trust yourself to regard your own worth as real. This evidence accumulates the same way physical mastery evidence accumulates, not through single dramatic demonstration, but through steady repetition of acts congruent with the value you claim to hold. And this accumulation is the foundation on which every other aspect of genuine confidence rests. The relationship between self-respect and the respect you command from others isn't transactional in any simple sense. It's not that you hold yourself to high standards and others automatically respond with admiration. The mechanism is more subtle. It's that the person genuinely regarding their own worth as real, not performing self-regard but actually inhabiting it, interacts with the world in ways reflecting that reality at every level. From largest decisions to smallest daily choices about what they engage with, what they walk away from, what they give attention to, what they decline. These interactions, consistent across time, create an impression of someone with somewhere to stand, someone not at the mercy of external conditions for their sense of whether they're okay, and the impression of someone with somewhere to stand, unable to be moved from fundamental position by social pressure, disapproval, or withdrawal of approval, is precisely the impression generating the deepest and most durable respect one person can extend to another. The compounding works in the negative direction too, which is why understanding matters and not simply assuming things will improve naturally over time. Every act of self-betrayal, every acceptance of treatment violating actual standards, every compromise on something genuinely important for approval or discomfort avoidance, every agreement with something you don't believe because disagreeing felt too costly, adds to different accumulation, adds to internal evidence that your standards are negotiable, that your worth is something you'll trade under sufficient pressure, that baseline for how you're treated is something you manage downward rather than upward. That evidence accumulating in you broadcasts itself through your behavior texture to everyone you interact with, tends to produce exactly the social conditions it reflects. People treat you as someone whose standards are negotiable when you've repeatedly demonstrated that they are. This isn't counsel of rigidity. Self-respect that can't adapt to actual complexity, can't distinguish between compromising on what genuinely matters and choosing appropriate flexibility in what doesn't, isn't wisdom. It's brittleness. The question is always whether the accommodation reflects genuine discernment about what actually matters versus simple unfamiliarity, discomfort, or the approval-seeking mechanism finding rationalization for capitulation undermining your foundation. That distinction requires the self-knowledge and honest self-observation discussed earlier. Where the distinction is clear, where you know what you're being asked to accept is genuine violation of something that matters, holding the standard is never merely a social choice. It's a foundational act of self-construction. Another addition to the evidence base on which genuine confidence is built. There's a quality you recognize immediately when you encounter it, even if you've never named it precisely. You notice it in how someone enters a conversation that's become heated, not with defensiveness or aggression most people bring, not with retreat that conflict-avoidant people deploy, but with genuine presence. You notice it in how they receive criticism, with the same unhurried attention they'd bring to any other information, without flinch or counterstrike. You notice it in how they occupy a room, not by dominating, not by demanding attention, but by being so entirely present, so completely themselves that their presence constitutes a gravitational fact organizing the space around them without effort. This quality is what it means to be genuinely unmovable, and it's the end state toward which every dimension of confidence development ultimately points. Being unmovable isn't the same as inflexibility. This distinction is critical and easily missed. The unmovable person isn't someone who can't be persuaded, can't change position, holds views with rigidity confusing certainty with strength. Quite the opposite. The unmovable person can change their mind with remarkable ease because their sense of self isn't invested in any particular position being right. They can be shown they were wrong and respond with genuine interest in the correction rather than defensive denial. Because being wrong about something doesn't threaten the foundation on which they stand. The foundation isn't made of being right, it's made of something more durable, knowing who they are and what they value and how they want to engage with the world. Independent of whether any particular belief survives contact with evidence, what they cannot be moved from is the center itself. They cannot be moved from their fundamental sense of their own worth by social pressure, criticism, disapproval, approval withdrawal, conflict, mistakes, rejection, failure. These experiences happen to them. They're not immune. But none has the power to remove them from the ground they stand on. They feel the impact and then return, with the reliability of a gyroscope, to center. Not through effort, not through coping strategy application, but through what might be described as trained natural buoyancy, a quality developed over years of consistent practice that eventually becomes something close to second nature. The path to this is long. It would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. There are no shortcuts to becoming unmovable because becoming unmovable isn't acquiring a technique or installing a belief. It's the culmination of a development process. The gradual building, through consistent choices and consistent practice over extended time, of a self that's genuinely grounded. A self that knows what it values and has demonstrated repeatedly willingness to act on those values when costly. A self that's felt disapproval, discomfort many times and learned, at nervous system level more than intellectual, that disapproval is survivable. A self that's failed and recovered, been wrong and acknowledged it, been uncertain and stayed present without being undone. These accumulated experiences don't happen quickly, but they happen with direction. Direction toward a center that holds. And the person building in that direction for long enough begins to feel ground under their feet in a way qualitatively different from anything available through performance. The unmovable person has a particular relationship with time worth examining. Most people caught in approval-seeking operate with implicit urgency, a need for social resolution to happen now, uncertainty about perception to be resolved immediately, ambiguous social situation discomfort to be shortened through action. This urgency produces a quality of rushing in social interactions. Rushing to fill silence, to resolve tension, to secure the approval signal relieving anxiety of not having it. The unmovable person doesn't have this urgency. They're not waiting for resolution that only approval can provide. They can let things develop, hold questions open, sit with social ambiguity with the equanimity they bring to ambiguity elsewhere. Because their sense of themselves doesn't depend on ambiguity being resolved any particular direction. And this patience, this capacity to be genuinely unhurried in situations where others rush, is itself a presence form commanding attention and generating respect without soliciting either. It's important to understand how the unmovable person handles being genuinely moved. This is where the concept is most easily misunderstood. Being unmovable doesn't mean being untouched by life. Doesn't mean processing loss without grief, receiving love without warmth, encountering injustice without anger, experiencing beauty without being affected. The unmovable person feels all these things, and often more fully than people defending against emotional experience. Because genuine groundedness doesn't require feeling suppression the way performed stoicism does. What it means to be unmovable is not that these experiences don't reach you. It's that they don't displace you. They move through you without removing you from center. The grief is felt fully and then metabolized, leaving behind honest loss residue without the existential destabilization grief produces in someone whose self-sense is fragile. The love is felt and returned without clinging desperation of someone needing it to justify self-worth. The anger at injustice is felt and, when appropriate, acted on cleanly without the additional charge of someone whose personal wound is driving response. Each experience is what it is, no more and less. Nothing is amplified by a threatened self's machinery reaching for evidence of its own value or significance. The last thing needing to be said about becoming genuinely unmovable involves what it costs and what it returns in terms worth complete honesty about. What it costs is the comfort of having your worth continuously confirmed by external sources. The person developing genuine internal groundedness is in a very real sense learning to live without the drug. And like withdrawal from any substance the nervous system has come to depend on, this has a period of genuine discomfort. The social anxiety that approval-seeking was keeping at bay doesn't immediately resolve when you withdraw from approval-seeking behavior. For a time, it can intensify. Because the coping mechanism has been removed before the underlying condition has been fully resolved. This isn't a sign something is wrong. It's a sign something is working. You're encountering the actual experience you were managing rather than continuing to manage it. And encounters with actual experience are the only path through it. What it returns is quieter and more profound than what most people expect. Popular imagination imagines confidence returning social triumph, a world where you command every room, every interaction goes your way. Others consistently recognize and acknowledge your worth. This is not what genuine confidence produces. What it produces is freedom. A life in which the quality of your experience is no longer principally determined by how any given social situation resolves. In which you can have a difficult conversation without it ruining your day, because the outcome doesn't constitute a verdict on your worth. In which you can make a mistake without it becoming a crisis, because the mistake tells you something about that specific decision and nothing about your fundamental value. In which you can be rejected without reorganizing your sense of yourself because you know, at a level social feedback cannot reach, that your worth isn't theirs to assign. This is what it means to have nothing to prove. Not the performed version. The person announcing they have nothing to prove always does. The actual version. The person who simply doesn't experience social situations as occasions on which their worth is being adjudicated. Because the adjudication is complete. Not because they've decided they're great. Not because they've convinced themselves through affirmation regime. But because they've built slowly, honestly, through actual work, an interior life grounded enough that the exterior world's assessment, however it comes, whatever form it takes, doesn't reach the foundation. The person living from this foundation moves through the world differently. They speak differently, with an ease that's not studied, a directness that doesn't require courage, because saying what you actually think doesn't feel like courage when you genuinely know what you think and genuinely stand behind it. They listen differently, without the divided attention of someone simultaneously composing their own contribution and managing the impression their silence is creating. They handle conflict differently, with groundedness able to engage substance without being destabilized by the disagreement itself. They receive success and failure differently, with proportionality that neither inflates good moments into worth evidence, nor deflates bad moments into unworthiness evidence. They are, in the fullest sense, themselves, not a performance, not a managed version calibrated for maximum social return, but the actual thing. And the actual thing, when it's present in its full, undiluted expression, is something other people's nervous systems recognize and respond to with something that has no better name than respect.
This is the destination. Not a personality type you have to become, not a set of behaviors to master, not a level of social success to achieve. It's a relationship with yourself. Honest, consistent, grounded, independent of conditions. That makes genuine presence possible. That makes genuine connection possible. That makes the kind of life you actually want to live possible. Not as a performance for others, but as the natural expression of who you actually are. When the noise of approval seeking finally genuinely quiets, the question isn't whether this is available to you. It's whether you're willing to do what it actually requires. For as long as it actually requires it, without the shortcuts, without the false promise of an easier way, because there is no easier way. But the way that exists is real, and everything in this script is pointing in its direction. The work begins now.